This film is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not aim to advertise, promote, or suggest any specific conduct. Case number 6. The king of a country that did not exist. Most con men sell you something worthless. Gregor MacGregor sold people something that did not exist at all. Not a fake gold mine, not a crooked stock, an entire country with a flag, a constitution, a currency, and a king. And the strangest part is this: the king was real. He had fought real wars and won real medals. He simply decided that a genuine reputation could be spent like money to buy the trust of a nation, and then sell that nation to people who would die for it. He was born on the 24th of December, 1786, at Glengyle, on the very edge of the Scottish Highlands. He carried one of the most romantic names in Scotland, MacGregor, the outlaw clan of Rob Roy, and he never let anyone forget it. At 17, he bought his way into the British Army. By his 20s, he had served in Portugal, married into money, and learned the single most important lesson of his life: that a good uniform and a confident manner will open doors that talent never could. In 1812, his first wife dead and his British career stalled, MacGregor sailed for South America and threw himself into the wars of independence. And here is where the legend becomes fact. He fought under Francisco de Miranda, then under Simón Bolívar himself. He was made a general, and in 1816, he led a desperate fighting retreat across hundreds of miles of enemy Venezuela, a feat so admired that men called him the Xenophon of the Americas. For one shining moment, Gregor MacGregor was exactly what he pretended to be: a hero. But the hero had a habit of overreaching. In 1817, he captured a small island off Florida with 80 men and proclaimed his own Republic of the Floridas, printing a flag and a currency before abandoning the whole thing weeks later. 2 years on, reckless raids on the Spanish coast ended in disaster, with the men he left behind captured or killed. By 1820, his battlefield star was fading. He needed a new idea. And on a humid stretch of the Caribbean coast, he found one. In April 1820, MacGregor sailed to the Mosquito Coast, a wild and barely mapped strip of jungle on the Gulf of Honduras. There he met a local ruler, King George Frederick Augustus of the Mosquito people. Over rum and gifts, the king signed a grant: roughly 8 million acres of unbroken wilderness, an area larger than Wales, handed to a Scottish adventurer in exchange for some jewelry and a quantity of drink. It was a worthless concession in a place almost no one in Britain had ever seen. MacGregor looked at that empty jungle and saw a kingdom. He gave the jungle a name: Poyais. He gave himself a title: His Serene Highness Gregor, Cazique of Poyais, a prince of a sovereign Central American state. And in the summer of 1821, he arrived in London at the most perfect moment imaginable. Britain was gripped by a fever for New World investment. Fresh young nations across South America were borrowing fortunes in the city of London. Into that fever walked a decorated Highland war hero, bowing as the ruler of a country no one had ever heard of, and London adored him. He was feted by the Lord Mayor and received like visiting royalty. The romance was irresistible: a brave Scot, fresh from liberating South America, now ruling a fertile young nation and inviting his countrymen to share its riches. And no one stopped to ask the obvious question. No one had been there. No one could check. In a world before telegraphs and photographs, a country was only as real as the paper that described it. So MacGregor decided to make a great deal of paper. In 1822, he published a book, 355 pages, bound and serious, credited to Captain Thomas Strangeways, aide-de-camp to the Cazique. The captain did not exist. MacGregor and his accomplices had written every word. But what words they were! Poyais, the book promised, had a remarkably healthy climate and soil so rich it gave 3 harvests of maize a year. Game filled the forests, fish filled the rivers. And in those rivers, the book swore, you could find globules of pure gold lying in the sand, waiting to be picked up. At the heart of it stood the capital, St. Joseph. The book described a flourishing seaside city of as many as 20,000 people. It had wide paved boulevards and colonnaded buildings. It had a theater. It had an opera house. It had a domed cathedral, a parliament, a royal palace, and a proper national bank. There were illustrations of its harbor, engravings of its grand port, as if any of it could be visited. Every line was an invitation, every detail was bait. And not one brick of it had ever been laid. The book was a sensation, reviewed, reprinted, and devoured by people who longed to believe in a fresh start. And it did exactly what it was designed to do. Ordinary families in England and Scotland began to read about St. Joseph the way you might read a travel brochure, not as a fantasy, but as a plan. They started to imagine themselves there, and once they could imagine it, MacGregor could sell it to them, one piece at a time. First he sold the land. Poyaisian acres went on the market for a few shillings each, cheap enough for a tradesman, real enough to feel like a future. Around 500 buyers handed over their savings for deeds to plots in a city that did not exist. Then he sold the offices of state. For the right price, an ambitious man could become a Poyaisian official, an officer, a man of rank in the new nation. People paid to govern a country that had no people, no streets, and no soil but swamp. Then came the masterstroke. MacGregor had the Bank of Poyais print real banknotes, Poyais dollars, engraved by the Bank of Scotland's own official printer, indistinguishable from the currency of any genuine state. Settlers preparing to emigrate were told to do a sensible thing, change their solid British pounds for the money they would need on arrival. So they did. They handed over real sterling and walked away clutching stacks of beautiful, official, utterly worthless paper. They had been robbed before they even left the harbour. And then the biggest swindle of all. In October 1822, one of the most respected banking houses in London floated a loan for the government of Poyais, £200,000, at 6% interest, in 2,000 bonds. Investors who never dreamed of emigrating bought the sovereign debt of a fictional nation, certain it would pay them back. For a brief, dizzying moment, the bonds of a country that did not exist were trading on the London market. MacGregor had not just invented a kingdom, he had given it a credit rating. But money was never the whole prize. The bonds and deeds were only fuel. What MacGregor truly needed were colonists, living people willing to cross an ocean and plant his flag in real earth. Settlers made the lie solid. A nation with citizens is harder to doubt than a nation on paper. And so, while investors counted their bonds in London, MacGregor turned to the families who had read the book and believed it. He was about to send them to their deaths. On the 10th of September, 1822, the Honduras packet sailed from London with about 70 emigrants aboard. They were not desperate paupers. Among them were doctors, lawyers, a banker hired to run the Bank of Poyais, skilled craftsmen, whole families, people who had sold homes and businesses to be there. They sang as they left. They believed they were sailing toward a city with an opera house. They were sailing toward an empty beach. 4 months later, a second ship followed. On the 22nd of January, 1823, the Kennesley Castle left the port of Leith, near Edinburgh, carrying nearly 200 more. Many were Scots, drawn by the magic of the MacGregor name and the promise of land of their own. Between the two voyages, around 250 men, women and children set out for Poyais. They were the last people on Earth who still believed the country was real. The first ship was already there. And what it had found, no one in Britain yet knew. When the settlers reached the Mosquito Coast, they searched the shoreline for the city of St. Joseph. There were no boulevards, no opera house, no cathedral, no harbour, no bank. There was mangrove, swamp, dense unbroken jungle, and the half-swallowed ruins of an old abandoned settlement. A few bewildered mosquito people watched from the trees. The capital of Poyais was not the ruin of a great city, it had simply never been built. The families stood on the beach with their trunks and their worthless banknotes, and slowly understood that there was nothing here at all. At first they tried to make the best of it, pitching shelters and waiting for the officials and supplies the book had promised. Nothing came. Then the dry season ended and the rains arrived, and with them the mosquitoes, malaria and yellow fever. The settlers, weakened and unprepared, began to sicken. The banker hired to run the Bank of Poyais is said to have grasped the full scale of the deception and shot himself. The dream had become a death trap. There was one last cruelty to come. The local king, George Frederick Augustus, the very man whose name MacGregor had used, learned that European settlers were dying on his land, holding deeds to sell it. He was furious. He declared that he had never made MacGregor a prince, never granted him a kingdom, never authorized the sale of a single acre. He revoked the grant entirely. The settlers were now squatters in a country that had never existed, on land whose owner wanted them gone. Their only hope was rescue from outside. Word of the catastrophe finally reached the British colony of Belize, and a relief vessel was sent. The survivors who could still walk were carried aboard and ferried to British Honduras, but it was far too late for most of them. By the time the rescue came, of the roughly 250 people who had sailed for Poyais, at least 180 were dead, killed by disease, by hunger, by despair, on the shore of a nation that was never anything but ink and imagination. Fewer than 50 would ever see Britain again. Meanwhile, more ships were already at sea, packed with fresh believers bound for Poyais. Alarmed British authorities scrambled to stop them, intercepting and diverting up to 5 more emigrant vessels before they could deliver their passengers to the same fate. One ship carrying around 100 more Scots was turned away to Belize. It was the only mercy in the entire affair, and it happened only because the dead had finally made the truth impossible to hide. First survivors limped back into Britain in October 1823, and the newspapers exploded. Here were the living witnesses to a nation that had never existed. You might expect that this was the end of Gregor MacGregor, exposed, ruined, dragged before a court. But MacGregor was already gone. Sensing the storm, he had quietly slipped across the channel to France, claiming his wife needed warmer air. He left the survivors to tell their story to a country that could no longer touch him. And then he did the most astonishing thing of all. He started again. In Paris, MacGregor rebranded Poyais as a republic and assembled a French company to recruit a fresh wave of settlers and float a brand new loan, this time for £300,000. But the French had read the reports from London. The authorities grew suspicious, stopped the would-be emigrants at the docks, and in December 1825 they arrested him. He was put on trial for fraud, alongside several associates, for inventing a nation and selling it twice. Surely at last, justice. The court considered the evidence and acquitted him. Only a minor associate was convicted. MacGregor walked free. Incredibly, even after all this, he was not finished. Back in Britain, he floated smaller versions of the Poyais scheme through the following decade and still found a few people willing to believe. The nation that had killed nearly 200 people would not quite die because the dream it sold was simply too tempting to bury. MacGregor had discovered the darkest truth in the whole history of fraud. People do not buy what is real. They buy what they wish were real. And here is how the story ends. In 1838, an aging Gregor MacGregor sailed back to Venezuela, the country whose independence he had genuinely helped to win. There he was not a swindler. There he was a hero. They restored his rank as a general, granted him a pension, and welcomed him home. On the 4th of December, 1845, he died peacefully in Caracas, 58 years old. He was buried with full military honors in the cathedral, his coffin carried by generals and ministers of state. Think about that. The man who invented a country, printed its money, sold its land and its bonds, and sent 250 people to a jungle where most of them died. That man was lowered into a cathedral floor as a decorated national hero, never convicted of anything. His victims got an empty beach and an unmarked grave. He got a state funeral. Poyais never existed. But the lesson of Poyais does, and it has never stopped being true. The most dangerous thing a con man can sell you is not a fortune. It is a dream you desperately want to believe.